I'm Leslie Gerwin. I am the Associate Director of the Program in Law and Public Affairs here in Princeton. And it's really my pleasure to welcome you here today to this event that we are co-sponsoring with the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs. I see many familiar faces around here, but for those of you who don't know, LAPA is the Center for and the coordination of the intellectual inquiry in law at Princeton. And a prominent part of our mission are programs for the entire Princeton community, which inquire into legal dimensions of policy issues that currently challenge our public officials, both in our country and around the world. You will note, if you came in this way, that we have several other programs scheduled in the very near future. In 2 weeks, we will be having a panel that will examine the changing nature of the legal profession and what it means for law. We have a book forum with author Professor Gordon Silverstein of Berkeley that will look at the relationship of law and politics. And we will be co-sponsoring an event, again with the Woodrow Wilson School, on immigration, detention, and deportation policies. As you can see, we're quite varied and diverse, and we welcome you to all of our public events. If you would like to be on our email, Judy Rifkin, our outstanding events manager, will be happy to add your name. And if you would prefer not to receive emails, you can consult our website regularly for upcoming events. We are especially pleased to open the semester with an examination of the issue of regulating executive compensation. I need not tell you that few issues in the current economic crisis elicit more emotional reaction than the salaries of some of the CEOs of our largest corporations and banks. In the spirit of LAPA's mission, we seek to go beyond the sound bites in which so many proclaim there ought to be a law. Thus, we're asking, ought there to be a law, which also implies, if there should be, what should that law say? But my role today is really limited to introducing our moderator, who will in turn introduce our distinguished panelists. From where I sit, one of Professor Viviana Zelizer's most important roles at Princeton is as an active member of LAPA's executive committee, meaning that her insights and guidance contribute to the growth and success of our program. But significantly, she is also the Lloyd Cotsen, class of 1950, professor of sociology, a department of which she was chair for several years. Viviana's recent research examined how interpersonal connections enter into the production, distribution, consumption, and transfer of economic value. Due both to her research and her reputation, she has been invited to participate in gatherings that have involved her in issues that will be raised in today's discussion. And I am personally very grateful to her for her assistance in putting together today's program. Viviana's accomplishments are far too numerous to detail, but it is worth noting that she has received awards at Princeton for outstanding student advising and for innovation in undergraduate education. And in 2003, the Economic Sociology section of the American Sociology Association named its annual book prize the Viviana A. Zelizer Distinguished Book Award. It is thus my profound pleasure to welcome Viviana.
Actually, when they named that award, I think they thought I was dead already, because they usually name these things after dead people. In any case, let me extend my own warm welcome to this very special discussion about executive compensation and its regulation, and reciprocally, Leslie, thanks. Do we really need this? Yeah. Yes, okay. Okay, I scream loud, but I guess not that loud. A special thanks to Leslie Gerwin for initiating this event. And it's, as she said, certainly a timely event. We're following up, among other things, on one of the key issues in the recent G20 gatherings agenda in Pittsburgh. And just more generally, and I'll just spend 2 minutes in a couple of reflections, the 2008 financial debacle that jolted the world has painfully dramatized the need for new economic paradigms. The crisis not only upset economic institutions and practices, but radically undermined prevalent understandings of how the economy works, so that the fantasy of free market ideologies crumbled with the along with the speculative, unregulated market policies and products it had spawned. And you surely all remember that even that staunchest of free market advocates, Alan Greenspan, the former chairman of the Federal Reserve, famously conceded in October of 2008 before the House Committee on Oversight and Government Reform that he had, quote, found a flaw in his free market ideology. Now, standard theories of compensation systems are equally being debunked. Certainly, pure efficiency explanations of payment systems as effective performance measures fail to account for the mind-boggling excesses of CEO compensation in recent decades, or the wild bonus culture spawned by Wall Street. So that we need to understand compensation systems not as, quote, pure economic transactions, but deeply cultural and structural arrangements. Usually in compensation disputes, at stake is not only the amount of money involved, but the form of the payment, the timing of the payment, and the meaning and moral standing of different kinds of payments. Now, if compensation systems do not simply emerge as efficient market solutions, then how we regulate their amount and form matters greatly. And to help us think about these important issues, we're really fortunate to have a set of three, we're missing one, but he should be here shortly, three eminently qualified speakers that come to this topic from very different perspectives and experiences. And we're really so grateful to them for taking the time out of their busy schedules and accepting to lead this discussion. So what I'll do now, I'll stop talking, but I will focus on introducing them, each in the order in which we expect them to speak. We may have a little change depending on when our third speaker arrives. And this is how the rules will be, that each of them will speak for about 15 minutes and share some of their reflections, and then we'll allot 15 minutes for any responses from the panelists to each other, and then we'll have time for a good general discussion. So, we're going to hear first from Ari Gabinet, who is Principal, Securities Regulation for the Vanguard Group, which is one, as you probably know, one of the nation's largest mutual fund and financial services firm. At Vanguard, Mr. Gabinet is responsible for a number of things, for the investment management, brokerage, transfer agent distribution and advice, tax and international and litigation, shareholder services, and data privacy functions in Vanguard's legal department. I know. And you're here with us. Okay, now, and there's more. Prior to joining Vanguard, Mr. Gabinet was the head of the Securities and Exchange Commission's Philadelphia office, responsible for the Commission's examination and enforcement programs in Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, West Virginia, and the District of Columbia. His tenure at the SEC was marked by a number of high-profile cases in, among others, the financial services areas, including revenue sharing, breakpoint discounts, market timing, late trading, and also cases involving broker-dealer regulation, accounting and offering frauds, Ponzi schemes, insider trading, and electronic theft of non-public information. Besides all that, Mr. Gabinet has published articles on a variety of topics, including corporate governance, private causes of action under the Investment Company Act, and the SEC's enforcement program in the biotech industry. He's a frequent speaker on securities regulation matters. And prior to joining the SEC, Mr. Gabinet was a litigation partner with Deckard LLP. Now, should I maybe introduce Rakesh, and then we'll, maybe in case, right, our third speaker appears. Okay, so it is also a great pleasure to introduce Rakesh Khurana, who's the Marvin Bauer Professor of Leadership Development at the Harvard Business School and a fellow sociologist. He has worked for many years on crucial issues concerning the selection, training, and succession processes involved in the CEO labor market. He has done so by moving away from individualistic accounts that focus exclusively on the personal attributes of corporate leaders and instead illuminates the cultural and structural processes underlying some very curious features of our contemporary corporate world. And I regularly assign Professor Khurana's work to my students. In fact, my students in an economic sociology course that I teach are reading his work this week. Okay, in any case, so, and they read from actually two of his books. His first pioneering book, Searching for a Corporate Savior, The Irrational Quest for Charismatic CEOs, and then his most recent book, From Higher Aims to Hired Hands, The Social Transformation of American Business Schools and the Unfulfilled Promise of Management as a Profession. And let me add that both of them were published by Princeton University Press. And the second book traces the evolution of management as a profession, focusing particularly on the institutional development of the MBA. Among other awards, this book was the winner of the 2007 Best Professional Scholarly Publishing Book in Business, Finance, and Management from the Association of American Publishers. Professor Khurana is also the author of multiple articles, and he has been recognized by the London Times as one of the Thinkers 50, which is a list of the 50 most influential management thinkers in the world. What I'll do now is I will introduce our third speaker. That way I won't interrupt the flow of their presentations, and you'll know who he is when he arrives. So we're introducing him behind his back. Okay. Robert Jackson is an attorney advisor in the Office of the Assistant General Counsel of the United States Department of the Treasury, and he's assisting the Treasury on matters related to executive compensation and corporate governance. Prior to joining the Treasury, Mr. Jackson practiced in the Executive Compensation Department at Wachtel, Lipton, Rosen, and Katz. He is now on leave from Columbia Law School, where his research projects emphasize the empirical study of corporate governance questions. His prior work has been the subject of rulemaking commentary before the Securities and Exchange Commission. And his most recent project, which he developed during his tenure as a research fellow at the Harvard Law School program on corporate governance, provides the first comprehensive study of executive compensation in firms owned by private equity investors. Mr. Jackson has previously worked in investment banking as an advisor on mergers and acquisitions and as a consultant to financial institutions. He's also published on a variety of topics, such as a new model of administrative enforcement, executive pensions, and 9 Justices, 10 Years, a statistical retrospective, which was published in the Harvard Law Review. So surely, with this panel, we may be actually able to solve all compensation issues this afternoon. In any case, I am looking forward to learning from all 3 experts, and my job will be to be the timekeeper. Okay, all right.
I left my glasses upstairs, so I'm going to wing it just a little bit.
What about your watch?
I was listening to Professor Zelizer talk about executive compensation being out of control, and if we're unhappy with, is this our third panelist?
Perfect. Welcome. We just introduced you, so they all know the stuff you've been doing.
Thank you for that kind introduction.
Yeah. After the introduction, I offered to give 5 of my minutes to you for rebuttal.
So shall I get started? He's going to go first. Oh, please go ahead.
I'm Ari.
Oh, hi. Robert Jackson.
Nice to meet you.
I'm so sorry I've been delayed. Good to see you.
That's okay. Glad your flight landed safely. I just started by saying that I left my glasses upstairs, and listening to Professor Zelizer talk about the excesses of executive compensation and the question of whether there should be a law and how can we rein in executive compensation if executives won't do it themselves, and do we need to have legislation or regulation of some kind? And Mr. Jackson, to the contrary notwithstanding, I think I'm going to be unpopular because I'm going to suggest that regulation is not the answer to whatever the right question is about executive compensation. So the first thing that I'm going to say about, I have a question about excessive executive compensation, and the question is it too much for what? That is the question. Too much for what or too much for whom, and what is the right measure? And do you really want Mr. Jackson or Mr. Feinberg or President Obama or the 535 people who represent us on Capitol Hill to be the ones who are deciding what executive compensation should be? And I guess I'm going to take a poll of how many people in the room would be happy with those 535 people setting your compensation. So if you're in favor of the government setting your own compensation, raise your hand. Okay, and what's the profession that you intend to go into? Go ahead. You raised your hand. You were brave. Academia, so you think that the government should set academic salaries?
I kind of do.
Okay. Seems like you're in the minority. You have a lot of other people who would be happy with the government setting their salaries?
The government does set its salaries to the tax rate.
Minimum wage?
So if you're working for minimum wage. But a lot of people would be uncomfortable with that because how does the government know what you're worth? I think that the minimum wage indicates that we think the market doesn't set a high enough level to prevent social strife and class warfare. Perhaps that's what it's about. Well, I come at this perhaps from a slightly different perspective than a lot of people. And I guess I have to say, when I was with the SEC, as a matter of policy, disclaimed the staff's remarks, and they certainly would disclaim anything that I say as a former staffer. In fact, they violently disagree with most things that former staffers say when they leave. And as an officer of the Vanguard group, I don't really speak for Vanguard, but I can tell you what we do, and my perspective comes from Vanguard as a major institutional shareholder that has really an acute interest. I hope some of you are Vanguard shareholders. If you are, you'll understand we have an acute interest in making your investment returns as high as they can be, and excessive compensation to executives, whatever excessive means, that comes right from your bottom line. It comes straight out of your return, especially at Vanguard, where the funds own the management company, and we are just overhead for all of the funds. So there's a direct line of sight from executive compensation, at the Vanguard group anyway, to the investors' returns. But we care about the returns in the funds for all of the investors. Oh, thank you so much. I haven't read a word that's on the page yet. I just made it a whole lot less. I promised that I would. And so we are, every day, we are at a practical level involved in dialogue with the 8,000 operating companies in the United States and others around the world about the level of executive compensation. We care about it acutely, and that's the lens that I bring to this analysis. Personally, as an individual, what my view is about executive compensation is informed by the fact that I'm an executive. So the more excessive it is, the better I like it. But you may not agree with that. So I really don't think that government regulation is the best way for us to approach the problem of executive compensation, if a problem indeed there is. It's a complicated question that involves not just the absolute amount of compensation, but also what are we getting for the compensation, and is compensation aligned with results? And again, without wanting to speak for the people at Vanguard who are actually involved in voting corporate proxies every year and who have discussions with corporate management and directors about the levels of executive compensation, we care much more, as a practical matter, about results and whether a pay structure at a particular company is aligned with the performance of the executives who receives it. So that if Lloyd Blankfein at Goldman Sachs receives total compensation in a given year that is greater than the budget of the Princeton school district, which indeed he may, that may be okay with us if the returns for shareholders are outsized and in line. And that's, again, that's the way we look at it. Now, there is a history of public outrage about executive compensation. I will say that as a human being, my joke to the contrary notwithstanding, I get outraged about executive compensation and the level of executive compensation. And you could reel off 10 names, 100 names, and I would be shocked at the amount of money that these people make. But I'm sure that there are people within 10 miles of where we are today who would be shocked at the amount of money that I make. And that's one of the reasons why I always ask that question, too much for who or too much for what, and who should decide? But it seems that at least since the first really large recorded boom and bust in the stock market, going back to 1929, executive compensation and outrage over executive compensation has been on people's minds, and it tends to come to the surface more when market performance is poor, and people sort of generally don't care when market performance is okay. But most of the efforts to regulate so far, and I'm going to leave Mr. Jackson's efforts out of it because we don't really know the result of that yet, they have not succeeded in reining in outrage over executive compensation. Beginning in the 1930s, approaches to government redress for what was viewed as excessive compensation have proceeded along two main lines. One is through the courts, and the one is through regulation or legislation. And in the courts, like almost everything else in the courts, the results are uncertain, but everything in corporate governance in the courts is judged by a so-called fiduciary standard. And that's the standard that you have to meet to prove that executive compensation, for example, is unreasonable or outrageous or somehow should be clawed back. And there were a series of lawsuits beginning in the 1930s, and again they picked up in the 50s and again in the 70s, in which, and then actually as recently Michael Eisner and Disney, with shareholders being outraged, but unable to convince courts that the level of executive compensation was so great that it represented an abandonment of fiduciary duty by the directors. And as long as the directors of the corporation who are setting the compensation are not personally interested in the outcome, and I think the sociologists will probably have a lot to say about how interested directors are even when they don't have a direct financial interest. But as long as the directors don't appear to have a direct financial interest, the courts are likely to give them the benefit of the doubt and to say, seems like a lot of money, but the directors paid attention during the presentation from the compensation experts, and they did their thing, and we're not going to overturn it. And so redress through the courts has always been on this subject, and probably always will be until there's a revolution in the courts of some kind, not the way that you're going to reverse any adverse trend that you see in executive compensation. The legislative and regulatory approach to executive compensation has been oblique. And I would say, if you judge by the current level of outrage and the current level of salaries and the amount of corporate profits that are consumed by executive compensation, and by the difference between the level of rank-and-file compensation or the minimum wage and average CEO compensation, you would say that regulation has not been successful in reining in what people think of as excess. What has the approach to regulation been? Well, as a former SEC regulator, I always start with my favorite agency, and that's the SEC. And like most of the SEC's regulation of executive compensation by the SEC has been disclosure-based, based on two ideas primarily. One, that informed shareholders will make better decisions and vote either with their feet to go invest in a different company or to vote the scoundrels out of office. And also by the concept coined by Justice Brandeis, that sunshine, disclosure, is the best disinfectant. Now, I suggest that has proved not to be the case, that Justice Brandeis has not proved correct on this particular subject, because disclosure of executive compensation began with the very first federal securities laws in 1933, and again in 1934 in the Exchange Act, and then the proxy rules were modified in 1938 to add more executive comp disclosure in proxy statements. And in the 70s, they were tweaked again. And then in the 80s and 90s, when, thanks to a combination of the Internal Revenue Code and professors at the Harvard Business School who championed options as a form of compensation, the SEC started ramping up the amount of disclosure about options and equity-based compensation that companies made. There has been a ton, even within the last 3 years, the SEC adopted more disclosure regulations about executive compensation. And now there's a whole section of the annual report in the 10K that's That's SEC speak for the basic disclosure document that a company produces for its shareholders every year. There's lots of discussion about compensation and how it's been set up, and they do their best to provide a minimum amount of information, and I think they're relatively successful in providing that. Why then, would you still have executive compensation at the level that it is, at a level that generates a huge amount of outrage? Performance-based compensation sounds like a good thing. You have people who are supposed to be minding the store on behalf of shareholders to make sure the directors are supposed to make sure that it doesn't get out of control. Disclosure hasn't stopped it from going up and up and up and up and up. And now we find ourselves in a period when there's a big divergence, publicly visible divergence, between the level of executive compensation and the performance of the companies for whom they are performing. That's, once again, generating this huge level of public outcry. We have not, until recently, with this current banking disaster, tried regulating salaries directly. And I think that we have a public will to do it in the case of the banks. I don't envy you your job. I think it's very difficult. But otherwise, I think that we would lack the political will in this country to have the government setting salaries for everybody. And I accept as fair commentary that the amount of money that you take home is regulated to a certain extent by the amount of taxes that you pay, or perhaps the minimum wage guarantees that you take home at least a certain amount so that you'll be within visual spotting distance of the poverty line, if not otherwise. But short of outright regulation, and the IRS's attempt to regulate by limiting the deductibility of salaries in excess of $1 million did not succeed. The regulatory efforts, either in the courts or legislatively or regulatorily, have not worked. So what is supposed to make this work? And in the absence of direct government intervention, what is supposed to work? Well, it's what Alan Greenspan said he was surprised didn't work, but it's supposed to be the free market, and there must be some flaw in the free market for executive compensation if things are going the way they're going. And from my vantage point at Vanguard, and being the spiritual and intellectual heir of its founder, Jack Bogle, who is a Princeton grad, by the way, I guess what I have to say is that since the 1930s, what you've seen in the U.S. markets, and maybe the markets around the world, is this growing separation of ownership from management. And that as the percentage of ownership that is in the hands of institutions as opposed to individuals has grown and grown and grown, so that rather than being an individual investor with an E-Trade account, most of you own your shares in a 401k and they are invested in mutual funds or in pension funds, which are large institutional investors. There's less direct accountability. You have less direct control over the destiny of the corporation in which you own shares. And that separation, Jack Bogle would say, and others would say, has sort of led directors to be less and less accountable to the shareholders for whom they're supposed to be negotiating with the management over the level of salaries. The thing that has contributed to this and made it worse, I would say, came out of places like Wachtell Lipton, and I don't want to insult your firm, but during the 1980s, there was the takeover boom. And many corporate governance structures were put in place to insulate management from threats from the outside. And perhaps inadvertently, some of those structures, things like staggered boards where directors are not all elected at the same time, and other things that were implemented have insulated directors as well from the voice of shareholders. So at Vanguard, we obviously we care very much about this stuff, and we see ourselves as a large shareholder, and we see ourselves frustrated in the effort to make our voice heard. A large institution that owns as much as 5, 6, 7, 8% of public companies, if we have trouble making our voice heard on a subject like executive compensation, how can the scattered individual shareholders around this room and around Princeton and around the East Coast and around the country and around the world hope to have an impact? The question about the market operating properly is shareholders are to be represented by the directors. And if the directors are not accountable through corporate governance structures to the shareholders, they are less accountable, less constrained in the setting of all kinds of management policies, including policies relating to executive compensation. And from a practical standpoint, Vanguard's approach is we need directors to be more accountable, and we need a greater voice with corporate management so that in addition to having our own policies about executive compensation that are mostly tied to the alignment of performance and pay, we are very much interested in corporate governance so that when issues come to corporate boards, whether presented by shareholders or otherwise, and sometimes even at the instigation of a company like Vanguard, to remove the obstacles to director accountability and to improve shareholders' ability to hold the directors accountable to act in their interests, we take a very strong interest in those kinds of things. And I think if I had one thesis...
2 minutes.
I'm kind of bringing it in right on time. If I had one thesis, my thesis would be that better director accountability through better shareholder voice in corporate affairs as a matter of corporate governance structure should help rectify some of the issues by holding corporate directors more accountable to create pay structures that align pay and performance. I didn't read a word.
Yes. So Mr. Jackson is going to follow with his 15 minutes of wisdom. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And many thanks for having me tonight. I'm very, very happy to have the opportunity to engage with Ari and others on these very interesting questions. And thanks to our gracious hosts here at the Program in Law and Public Affairs for giving us an opportunity to talk about some of these very important questions. My name is Robert Jackson, and I'm an attorney advisor at the Department of the Treasury, where I work in the Office of the General Counsel, and where I'm serving as a deputy to Ken Feinberg, the Special Master for TARP Executive Compensation. And I'm very happy to have the opportunity to hear both from my colleagues on the panel and from you here in the audience about the considerations that we're thinking about as we make these very difficult decisions. And before we begin, I want to note that although I'll summarize here some remarks that the Secretary and the President and others have made, and other statements by Treasury officials, in all other respects, my comments reflect my own personal views and should not be attributed to the Treasury or to the Special Master. And while I'm glad to share my perspectives on this area generally, and I'm very happy to have your questions in particular, in light of privacy and related considerations, I'll have to stay away from discussion of individual and specific compensation decisions involving individual employees or companies. Now, as Ari touched on, the issues we'll be discussing today have been the subject of debate among academics, practitioners, and the public for a very long time. But the financial crisis has given heightened importance to the issues. And while the crisis had many causes, I think it's clear that executive compensation and the alignment between compensation practices and risk were among the causes. And as Secretary Geithner recently noted, these kinds of practices gave employees strong incentives to take risks that were inconsistent with structural stability as well as shareholder interests. The appropriate role of regulation and legislators in this debate has been the subject of considerable analysis. But what is clear is that striking the balance between this complex relationship between pay for performance and risk and all the considerations that go into setting a compensation structure will require unprecedented cooperation among regulators, practitioners, and experts in the field. As I mentioned, the SEC has long been involved in these efforts, and that's why when the Secretary announced our new regulations on executive pay for firms that have received assistance under the TARP and for other firms, we brought together a number of experts in the field, as well as Chairwoman Shapiro, Federal Reserve Governor Dan Tarullo, and other experts to help us understand how we can best bring compensation structures in line with the interests of shareholders. We've just started that work, but I want to talk about a few of the principles that the Secretary has articulated that will govern sort of the way the administration has been thinking about the very hard balance we're trying to strike. First, the Secretary has said that compensation plans should be structured to reflect firm-specific performance, and I want to talk about what that means a little bit. The notion of pay for performance is sort of something that's easy to understand at a high level, but a number of academic studies and other analysis has begun to show that a lot of pay for performance that we see in the marketplace actually measures absolute performance rather than firm-specific performance. And I think the Secretary has made clear that what we're looking for are compensation structures that actually reward added value on a firm-specific basis, rather than rewarding executives for generally rising tides. In addition, I think what we're thinking about is having incentives that are aligned with the time horizons of risk. And this is particularly true at financial services companies where executives are making risk decisions that aren't 6 months away or a year away, but sometimes they're 30 years away when they're, for example, mortgage securities. And those designing comp plans, I think, are going to have to think a lot about what kind of risk-taking decisions executives are facing every day. And we want to avoid plans that put executives in a position to collect what are the functional equivalents of short-term premiums on long-term risks that are being financed by shareholders and taxpayers. Third, I think we're looking for comp practices that avoid incentives to take risks that endanger the soundness of the institution. The Secretary has talked a great deal about the importance of having governance structures and incentive arrangements that give risk managers in our financial institutions the ability and the incentive to stand up when they see risks that are either threatening on a systemic level or an institutional level, and ensure that compensation plans do not encourage that kind of risk. And last, the Secretary has said, and this is something I'd be very interested to hear my colleagues on the panel talk a little bit about, that certain compensation practices such as golden parachutes and certain excess retirement payments, it's not clear whether they link pay to performance, and they should be re-examined. So I want to say something about what the principles I've just described do not endorse. In response to something that Ari raised earlier, the Secretary has made very clear that this is a principle-based approach. It's a fact-specific analysis. We don't support the capping of pay. We don't support precise prescriptions for how companies should go about setting compensation. These are standards that are designed to encourage our companies to do the very hard work of striking this balance between compensating executives in a way that rewards effort but does not encourage risk. And we're trying to encourage them to do it in a way that encourages dialogue with shareholders, regulators, and other stakeholders in the corporate decision-making process. Now, there's the rule we promulgated that governs compensation practices at all TARP firms reflects this view that although these are sort of good general principles to keep in mind, what we need in order to understand how compensation is optimally set is a case-by-case individualized analysis. So as was required by the statute, there were two statutes at the time of the financial crisis. First, the Emergency Economic Stabilization Act, and then the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. As required by the statutes, we've set forth certain standards for limiting compensation at these firms, and we've gone even further, actually, than the statute required, and we've limited the payment, for example, of things like tax gross-ups, which have substantial costs for shareholders that may outweigh the benefits for executives. We also go a little further in the area of disclosure, requiring TARP recipients to tell us more about, for example, what kind of perquisites they're giving executives and the role that a compensation consultant may have played in setting pay. But what's most important to me about the way we went about the rule is that it acknowledges that the appropriate compensation structure in a particular case is likely to vary among individual executives and even within a firm that have received exceptional assistance from the government. And it's that acknowledgement, that understanding that it's a fact-specific analysis we're likely to be engaged in that led to the creation of the office in which I'm now serving, the Office of the Special Master for TARP Executive Compensation. The Special Master, as Ari alluded to, is empowered to approve compensation payments for the most senior executives and then the next 20 most highly compensated executives at the 7 companies that have received exceptional assistance from the government. And those companies are AIG, Citi, Bank of America, GM, GMAC, Chrysler, and Chrysler Financial, all companies that received assistance outside of our generally available programs. Recognizing how important it was that this be a sort of careful balance between the historical compensation practices and what we're looking for in terms of prospective structures, the Secretary appointed my boss, Kenneth Feinberg, who's an accomplished mediator who's been widely praised for his leadership of the September 11th Victims Compensation Fund, to be the special master. So, consistent with the principles-based approach I described before, the rule sets forth a number of principles that the special master must consider when making his decisions about executive pay. The rule requires, for example, that he approve only structures that avoid incentives to take excessive risk, that reflect the need for the company to remain competitive, some of the considerations that were mentioned earlier, that allocate appropriately among the various elements of pay, provide performance-based compensation, and other manifestations of the principles I talked about earlier. But aside from these general principles, the rule gives the special master considerable discretion in deciding what an appropriate compensation structure will be at one of these companies. So, in the Office of the Special Master, we've required each recipient of exceptional assistance to submit proposals as to what kind of compensation structure they'd like the senior executives and the next 20 most highly compensated employees to be compensated. Under the rule, those proposals were required by August 14th, and the special master on August 31st determined that the proposals were substantially complete as a matter of law under the rule, which means that as a matter of law under the rule, the special master's determinations with respect to those structures will be due no later than October 30th. So we've prepared for how to go about doing this review in a number of ways, and as my colleague alluded to earlier, this is an unprecedented effort in many ways. And so we've thought a lot about how we can go about understanding what kind of compensation arrangements are likely to meet the goals and the principles I've just been describing. So we started by sitting down with each exceptional assistance recipient, as a shareholder might, and trying to get a sense for what the business objectives of the enterprise are. I want to give an example that might help understand why those conversations were so important, have been so important to our considerations. So take, for example, the difference between two different TARP recipients. One is trying to continue as an ongoing profit-making enterprise, and another that's winding down its operations. So the incentives that will ensure that executives in the expanding firm manage that growth properly, and the incentives that will ensure that the executives in the wind-down firm handle that in a manner consistent with shareholders and taxpayers' interests, will be very different. Indeed, a compensation structure that works in one of those cases may create incentives for excessive risk-taking in the other. And that's why it was so important that we start with an understanding of the business objectives from both a shareholder and a taxpayer perspective of each of these firms. We've also been thinking a great deal, both the Special Master and the Treasury, about corporate governance mechanisms that will help ensure the structure of compensation is in line with these principles I've described. Now, the interim final rule also provides some basic standards, some basic guidelines that all TARP recipients have to follow. For example, they've all got to have independent compensation committees, and they've all got to have an annual say-on-pay vote. I'll talk about that a little more in a bit. But again, in the corporate governance context, sort of individualized considerations are really critical. And I'll give you another example. Consider that example I described before, where you have one firm that's continuing as a profit-making enterprise and another that's winding down. Well, for firms in the first category, I think we'll care a lot about governance arrangements that have to do with, for example, underwriting standards, so that we understand what kind of growth the firm is experiencing from a credit risk point of view. But in the second type of firm, in the wind-down situation, we're likely to care a great deal more about marginal measures of risk. So the governance protections we'll care about there will be very different. And in both cases, we're going to want the right corporate governance arrangements to be sure we get pay right, but it's going to be equally important, I think, to acknowledge the different business considerations that are motivating those structures. So, just to give a little bit of background on what we've been doing, of course, to make the determinations we're trying to make, we need extensive understanding of each employee's duties, role, future role in the company. And so we've received from each of the exceptional assistance firms detailed descriptions of historical performance, historical compensation for these individuals, and a broad range of detail about exactly how they were paid and why they were paid that way. And that'll allow us to understand the slate against which we're writing, the extent to which existing compensation arrangements will affect future incentives that the employees will have. And because we care so much about these kinds of incentives, we've also talked with these companies about qualitative performance measures they've used to figure out how these employees are doing their work. So, for example, we've got comparative and competitive analysis among each type of employee for how their performance has been and why companies have made the decisions they've made. And that helps the special master, I think, understand both the existing relationship between compensation and performance and the best way to structure compensation arrangements going forward to be sure that the pay-performance link remains strong and that the compensation structures are in the interests of taxpayers and shareholders. So, as I've mentioned, in my view, the Office of the Special Master in its creation, its very existence, although unprecedented, reflects a nuanced understanding of this problem. It reflects a sense that individualized consideration is going to be critical and, in fact, determinative in almost every case when setting compensation. But I also expect that the work we're doing, that the Special Master's general rulings, are going to give rise to a group of best practices that have been uniquely tested in a very difficult crucible, and so are likely to be informative for financial institutions and others going forward. Now, of course, which practices are best is going to be determined, I think, by directors and shareholders in the future. But I think the Office of the Special Master will be in a unique position to contribute to that debate. And the lessons that we learn, I think, from the Office of the Special Master and our work are going to be things that we'll want to think about and consider in that conversation going forward, just as we do the views of shareholders and of academic experts. I want to note, just in closing and in response to something that was said earlier, that Treasury's efforts to reform compensation, to get these difficult questions right, are actually not limited to the work of the Office of the Special Master. We propose legislation that would require each public company in the United States to hold an annual, what's called a say on pay, a non-binding shareholder vote on executive compensation. And that's such an important step, in my view, because it allows folks like Ari to communicate with management about compensation arrangements and to make it stick, to have that discussion in a way that's going to result in a public vote about compensation arrangements. And in the shadow of that possibility, we expect that directors will be even more responsive to shareholder considerations when setting pay. Our legislation also requires that compensation committees be more independent and have access to independent objective advice. And these are the kinds of things that will apply to all public companies in the United States, not just those that have received TARP funding. So, in closing, I think I'd like to note that we're tempted in a debate like this, especially with all the public rancor, to think that it's binary, to fall into the trap of a false choice, to expect that we have a choice between letting the market work or to regulate. In fact, in a nuanced question like setting compensation properly, it strikes me that the truth, as usual, is somewhere in between. That we have great hope and faith that markets will work properly if we give them the opportunity and the tools to do so, but that we also expect that government, and in this case, an individualized consideration provided by an objective third party, can help guide us to those best practices. And one reason I'm here tonight is to get a sense from you in the audience and from my colleagues on the panel as to what those might be. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Exactly 15 minutes. Very disciplined group. Okay.
All right. I hope I don't break it. First of all, I want to sort of echo my thanks for being invited with such distinguished panelists and a distinguished moderator. I'm very grateful to be here at Princeton, especially given the fact that I was rejected when I applied in high school. So we're having this panel discussion in the midst of an unprecedented political debate about what to do about executive compensation. And this is in part fueled by the economic crisis, as Ari noted, and the multi-billion-dollar taxpayer-financed bailout of our financial industry, ranging from banks to insurance companies, as Professor Jackson just noted. It's also due to the fact that the U.S. government is now the direct majority owner of the largest industrial concern in the world, General Motors. But executive pay, however, has been an issue for the last several years. Even prior to the current crisis, intense debate had emerged around questions about the factors that explain CEO pay and the explosion in CEO pay. And moreover, I think, as was rightly noted, was that over the last 7 or 8 years, there's been a recognition that the issue of executive compensation and explaining its spectacular rise is complex and nuanced, and is in part endemic to the kind of market and institutional system which has dramatically changed over the last half-century since the Great Depression. And therefore, to arrive at an appropriate solution or the answer to the question of whether we should have regulation, we have to start asking ourselves some fundamental questions about what purpose compensation plays and whose interests are being served or not being served by the existing system. The problems around executive compensation have become so intense that the United States has been compelled to appoint a pay czar in the form of Professor Jackson's boss, Ken Feinberg. And historically, politically appointed czars have been brought to bear on society's most intractable and critical problems, such as drugs, AIDS, and climate change. All of these are problems that are seen as having significant impact on the world and cannot be solved through traditional solutions and require the attention of many different institutions. And I see two challenges with addressing the issues of executive compensation. First, it can become a passionate debate informed more by emotion and ideology than by facts. And second, it's not an issue that's often discussed in the context or examined holistically with respect to its implications for both organizations and for the society at large. So let's start with the facts. The CEO of the median S&P 500 company made about $7.6 million in 2007. To put this number in perspective, in 1960, the ratio of CEO pay to the President of the United States was about 2 to 1. Today, it's about 20 to 1. If average pay for factory workers had risen as fast as CEO pay, it would be about $120,000 per year rather than $24,173 per year. If minimum wage had risen as fast, it would be about $24 an hour rather than $7.25 per hour. In 1983, the ratio of CEO pay to the average worker was about 42 to 1. By 1999, it had gone to 475 to 1. It peaked in 2000 at about 530 to 1. And in 2008, it settled to about 300 to 1. Again, just to put these numbers in some perspective, the comparable ratios with other advanced industrialized countries are in the UK about 25 to 1, in France 16 to 1, in Germany 11 to 1, and in Japan 10 to 1. There are three reasons that you heard earlier that are often used to explain the level of CEO pay. First, that CEO pay is tied to long-term performance. That is not true. And no matter how many times it's said by CEOs and boards and compensation consultants, it does not make it true. Seldom has more an untoward wrong fact been perpetuated. Scores of academic studies show that the typical long-term incentive plan, what's called an LTIP in the lingo, is 3 years. Moreover, despite 2 decades of stock option grants, the average CEO holds the same amount of stock they did in 1992. Executives do not hold their stock. Academic studies by Lucian Bebchek and others have shown that as soon as their stock options vest or their restricted stock restrictions are removed, CEOs sell their shares almost immediately. Moreover, when executives fail, they're protected by very generous severance packages that typically result in tens of millions of dollars of payout for the average dismissed CEO in the Fortune 500. The second reason to explain high levels of CEO pay are that the market processes of supply and demand set the wage levels. CEO pay, in other words, is no different than the way pay is set for a star athlete or a movie star. In an interview with Bloomberg News 2 weeks ago, President Obama questioned whether we should be capping pay of executives because we don't do it for NFL players or other superstars. Again, in addition to the fact that NFL player salaries are in fact capped using team caps, President Obama's comments suggest an inaccurate understanding of the CEO pay setting process. Well-functioning markets are characterized by large numbers of buyers and sellers transacting relatively anonymously. CEO pay is a small numbers game with very little transparency. When a major movie star or sports star sits down to negotiate a multi-million-dollar pay contract, they're usually sitting across from someone who wants to pay them less. By contrast, when a company is paying a CEO, he's usually sitting across, and it is a he more often than not, from himself, or at least a board of directors he's had a hand in selecting. Moreover, when an athlete or a movie star's performance is measured, it's difficult to manipulate the results. Goals scored, how much a movie opened with, is not easily hidden, obscured, or manipulated. The same cannot be said of financial reports. The third argument given to explain the high levels of executive pay is that if you don't pay these amounts, you won't get the executive talent you need. Again, this flies in the face of research. When companies are asked to identify their most valued managers, and these managers are surveyed, executive pay as a motivator ranks fourth. People want to be paid fairly, but what they rank first is the vision of the company, feeling as if they are part of something bigger than themselves, and making a positive contribution to the world. In fact, the greater the gap between CEO pay and the average worker in the firm, the greater the level of distrust and the lower the sharing of information in that firm. Correspondingly, there are also lower levels of investment in management training and development programs and weaker governance in firms characterized by high ratios of CEO pay to average worker pay. An extraordinary amount of evidence from social science suggests that, in fact, pay for performance schemes that are geared toward using extrinsic motivators as reward and punishment systems rarely have their desired effects. In numerous laboratory studies by social scientists ranging from Teresa Mablé to Robert Frank to careful field studies by Michael Beer, these researchers find that many of these schemes don't create the desired effect. Indeed, what they do find is that over-leveraged extrinsic rewards do not create commitment. They merely and temporarily change what we do. Michael Beer, for example, finds that rewards come to be seen as punishments when they're withheld, which may account for why so many systems are rejiggered when they're not going to be paid out. Inequality in reward ruptures relationships, as Robert Frank has found, and rewards undermine the essential intrinsic interest that might have been there in doing the job right in the first place. Now, some people may argue that CEOs and executives are not like other people, so we shouldn't generalize from these types of studies. The individuals attracted to these positions are a distinct type. I think there's actually some truth to this point, but I'm not sure it necessarily attracts the kinds of people who build long-lasting institutions. Research also highlights that certain types of compensation systems attract certain types of people. If you pay people like mercenaries, you attract mercenaries. You will not attract people whose primary loyalty is to others rather than to their self-interest. In other words, you don't attract leaders. This is perhaps why business is now among the least trusted institution in society. The 2009 Edelman survey, which examines the attitudes of elites, so these are people who are actually college-educated, graduate professionals, finds that only 13% of those people trust what CEOs say. Moreover, business executives trust each other even less than that. The current pay system does not attract or reward economic stewardship or fiduciary behaviors. Moreover, for those of us who care about the free enterprise system, the cynicism that executive pay generates may be capitalism's greatest threat. In fact, to conclude my comments with respect to the context and the legitimacy of the free enterprise system, I'd like to put forth the argument that our current compensation system has corroded the character of business in a profound way. More than 20 years ago, the late sociologist Robert Nisbet described the emergence of a particular character type that he said was beginning to dominate the leadership of our basic political, economic, and social institutions. Building on Samuel Johnson's description of an unconstrained individual who, like a parasite, to quote, hung loose upon society, Nisbet called this new character type the loose individual. The loose individual, Nisbet argued, does not feel constrained by norms arising from social values such as fairness and equity. The loose individual does not believe in allegiances to social institutions such as nations, firms, or even occupations. Loose individuals, Nisbet said, lack any sense of, quote, moral responsibility, often, quote, playing fast and loose with other individuals in relationships of trust and responsibility. Outside of their intimates, their relations with others are transactional, anchored only in self-interest. The economic collapse and now the almost decade-long sordid revelations around executive compensation, golden parachutes, unearned bonuses, and misleading financial statements makes it clear that the loose individual, once associated with confidence games and running the local numbers racket, now dominates the inner sanctum of capitalist activities. Whether on Wall Street or in the executive suites and boardrooms, the loose individual has radically reconfigured the financial, governance, and technical apparatus of American capitalism and its economy. Many structural, political, and cultural factors may have helped create the loose individual, including a lack of regulatory restraint that encouraged imprudent risk-taking, poorly designed compensation systems that motivated short-term behavior, and weak governance and oversight that led to a collapse of internal control systems. Recently, social commentators, academics, and the general interest media have started to focus their attention on one type of institution that has trained large numbers of our present-day business leaders, university-based business schools, of which I'm one of the faculty who teaches in one, and also a product of an MBA program. I want to share something with you. Last year, some graduating MBA students at the Harvard Business School took the equivalent of a Hippocratic oath that sought to put management on a more ethical footing and oriented toward creating long-term sustainable value for society. I just want to read the preamble of it, and you can read it online, mbaoath.org. It says, as a manager, my purpose is to serve the greater good by bringing together people and resources to create value that no single individual could build alone. Therefore, I will seek a course that enhances the value of my enterprise can create for society over the long term. I recognize that my decisions can have far-reaching consequences that affect the well-being of individuals inside and outside my enterprise, today and in the future. As I reconcile the interests of different constituencies, I will face difficult choices. And it goes on to talk about the difference between creating value versus extracting value, the use of integrity. I will be accountable to my peers, and they will be accountable to me for living by this oath, and this oath I make freely upon my honor. Turns out this oath is quite a contentious issue at the Harvard Business School. Yesterday's newspaper, as I was coming in from the school newspaper, came up with a student who actually argued against the oath. And he says, most worrisome is that what first seems like innocuous language and progressive thinking is really the failed ideologies of history masquerading as enlightenment. Signatories must forswear decisions and behaviors that advance my own narrow ambitions but harm the enterprise and the society it serves. The student goes on to say, one is not simply there to preserve the environment, and this is in the case of environmental sustainability, but to create benefits for it. Of course, sustainability in its modern form is invariably a code word for wealth transfer from shareholders to third parties. All popular prescriptions for social and environmental progress are inevitably the same: socialism. Student goes on to talk about kumbaya, and then basically says, it's easy to, and then critiques our own school for the hypocrisy that it represents. And he says, but I assure you that your best contribution to society will be if you work for your self-interest. Less people are hungry today and living better because of greed. Goes on to say, until you've, if you have an invention, see through to fruition. Do not settle for second place. Take risks, compete, strive until you have nothing left. And when the fruits of your ingenuity and hard labor redound to your reward, do not apologize to people who will both demonize your immorality when you fail and criticize your materialism when you succeed. Those who hitchhike on the wings of capitalists. I would quibble with the student's definition of socialism and his obvious ahistorical understanding of capitalism and the values that sustain and undergird it. It is also sociologically interesting to see life imitating art when the student's essentially paraphrasing Gordon Gekko's speech in the movie Wall Street. However, what is most disconcerting for me is the type of leader the student will be in business and society. The future of a society is intimately linked to the types of leaders it produces. Here is a student who believes in a Nietzsche Übermensch view of being entirely self-generated. I'm not questioning that all of us freely make choices about who we want to be and the dignity of our self-authoring our identities. At the same time, our freedom of deciding who we want to be is also profoundly shaped by others around us, by its limits and circumstances not always of our choosing. No one shapes his or our identity arbitrarily, but we all build our own I on the basis of a self which is given to us. I would argue that a person who seeks to lead society's economic resources and impact its welfare is compromised if he or she claims to be solely responsible for producing what he becomes. I am not against profit. Indeed, I often see myself as a private in the capitalist army, but profit is only useful if it serves as a means toward an end that provides both a sense of how to produce it and how to make good use of it. If a profit becomes the only imperative, if it is produced without concern for how it was produced, the negative externalities it may have generated, its impact on child labor or the environment, and without the common good as its ultimate end, it risks destroying the wealth that it creates and creating poverty. We are now presented with choices around sustainability, pandemics, climate change, and the environment that concern nothing less than the survival and the destiny of human beings. The technical forces in play, the global interrelations, the damaging effects on the real economy of badly managed and largely speculative financial dealings, the unregulated exploitation of the Earth's resources, all of this should lead us to reflect on a type of system that we have created and the types of people who are leading this system. The different aspects of the crisis and the role that our reward and compensation systems played in it requires a new holistic re-examination, not only of our regulatory rules, not only of what laws and how the Delaware court should decide about the business judgment rule when it comes to compensation, but the economic system we have created. We now have the unique opportunity in the wake of our economic crisis to replan our journey and our destination. We have the prospect of articulating a new vision to which we are called by, to a world that is in profound need of a new vision and a new cultural and moral renewal. By rethinking the nature of our compensation system, the question that we actually have to bribe people to do the job that they were hired to should cause us to fundamentally re-examine the cultural norms within which we're making these decisions. By rethinking, I think, the nature of our executive compensation within our larger economic and social systems and the challenges we face as a global society, we can actually possibly create a new model of social economics that rests on the fundamental values that allow us to build a more sustainable and viable future. And it's a future in which I hope we don't have to bribe this student to do the duties that society has entrusted on him.
Leslie, as your organizer, I want to consult. I think we have 15 or 18 minutes left. Maybe we should open it up to the audience who has been patiently, but actually lucky to hear all these insights, but may want to. Why don't you, we're open for questions. Yeah, come to the mic and address it to, either the panel or a particular person.
Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming.
And please introduce yourself.
You want my name?
No, whatever.
Your
My name is Michael, but for reasons that have become clear when I asked my question, I don't want to give my whole name. So I'm a 25-year veteran of Wall Street. I have been involved in many of the businesses that have created many problems, i.e. derivatives. I am familiar with, either directly or indirectly, with many of the characters that you indirectly described. I 100% endorse Mr. Khurana's first 3 quarters of his talk. This notion that CEOs don't trust each other was no better proven than last September when they wouldn't lend money to each other because they knew that their balance sheets were skeptical or dodgy at best. My question regards or is informed by this notion of too big to fail. Whether we like it or not, we've already identified that there are probably 8 to 10 institutions that are too big to fail. But this administration has said that in the case of Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, and Morgan Stanley, since they were able to pay back their money in June of this year, that they're not subject to the same compensation restrictions that these other entities are. I wanted to know, why did we allow those 3 institutions to accrue bonuses at 50% of revenues for the first 6 months of this year when they were still TARP recipients? And knowing that these institutions are too big to fail, why can't we regulate them in terms of compensation? And thirdly, this notion that performance should be specific to an institution. The fact of the matter is, the way the markets work, a rising tide does lift all boats. And so even if Vikram Pandit gets, X millions of shares and the stock today is at 4, when all these shares go up, another 30%, he's going to be going up 30%. So I think that's a very tough challenge you have. But why is it that these guys are off the hook for the first 6 months, which also is going to be their best 6 months of this year?
Okay, so you're addressing that to okay, thank you.
You sure you don't want that one?
I have my own theories, but you have facts.
As a shareholder, I'm holding you accountable.
So it's they're all excellent questions. So let me start with the institutions that repaid TARP funds. As a matter of the law, the standards that we put out in the interim final rule weren't effective until we promulgated the rule, which we did on June 15th. And the legislators who passed the legislation underlying the statute, in particular Senator Dodd, said as much. Senator Dodd did in a letter to the SEC. But I don't think it's quite right to say that those institutions in any meaningful sense got off the hook for 2 reasons. First of all, as the Secretary said many times, I think it's clear that the federal banking regulators are going to come out with new standards that are going to be tough and meaningful, and they're going to be integrated in the regulatory process and in the bank supervisory process in a way that's going to help reform pay practices at even those firms. So I think you're going to see new supervisory standards that are going to, and the Secretary said many times that he's supportive of the development of these new standards that are going to affect practices at these institutions. I also think that the legislative proposals I talked about before are going to make a difference on this front. As I mentioned, we've proposed legislation, and the House has passed the legislation that would require say on pay at these companies, that would require much more independence at the compensation committee level. And my own view about how that will affect practices at these institutions is that to the extent that what we're seeing is a manifestation of a cultural shift, these kinds of reforms, which encourage shareholder participation and which emphasize independence are the kinds of things that make institutions take another look at their compensation practices. So I think those institutions are going to change the way they compensate their employees. I think we're already seeing some of that, and I think we haven't yet got to the end of that story. So I'd say at least until we've seen the federal banking regulations and we got a little bit of a better sense for how these institutions are going to operate in the new regime that we're helping to bring about, I think I'd reserve judgment on whether or not compensation practices at those institutions still reflect the kinds of cultural norms you were describing.
Any of you want to?
Well, I think, one of the questions in my mind that your question raises, the too big to fail, is I think it partly also reflects in many ways, the orientation of the people making the decisions. President Summers, Harvard President Larry Summers, who's now, he has a fetishism with finance, and he sees finance as a value-creating activity. And if you have a particular orientation, you evaluate decisions through that lens, no differently than I might evaluate things through a sociological lens, or you might evaluate things through a legal lens. And I think we have created in many ways, as finance went from a certain percentage of the economy to more than 40% of the profits, a view that somehow this is so essential to the American economy, and we're willing, just like we've subsidized mining and railroading in the past, that this is part of the future of the economy for the United States. I think it's a questionable assumption about whether it's a value-creating activity or a value-extracting activity, but that's an empirical question.
Well, if you look at M&A activity, which is really the source of the huge growth in investment banking, you would say it's a value extractor, and the vast majority of the transactions, they are not value creators, they are value destroyers. But what they do is they create wealth for the people who facilitate the transactions, which is why it becomes the go-to place for bright young MBAs. Unfortunately.
Trading.
Now, if it's too big to fail, then basically we're having insurance costs. Why are we letting project traders? Secondly, with respect to your response, you're going to have to back out of accrued bonus dollars in the first half of this year. So you're reserving, judgment in that respect in the position you have to do that. But for us to get to some sort of end, they have to back out all that accrual.
Okay, so any more of this, or we'll see any open? Yeah, okay.
My name's Maura Kelly. I'm a second-year student at the Woodrow Wilson School in the Public Affairs program. And I have two questions, and I guess you can pick which one you want to answer. And the first one is to you, Mr. Gabinet, is that? And it's about just kind of, you talked about better corporate governance structures as being really important, and I guess I just want some more specifics on what those might look like, and specifically, what incentives do those companies have to put those in? If we haven't seen them happening now, what's going to change that, and is it really going to be this kind of public outrage? Is that enough? And then the second one is more kind of bringing some of the sociological points that you discussed to another industry, and that's the industry of teachers. I'm a daughter of two high school teachers and come from a family of teachers, and there's all this discussion of Michelle Rhee in the DC public schools, who's trying to change the teacher incentive system in DC, and kind of so this idea of if you pay like a mercenary, you're going to get a mercenary. I'm just wondering, to what extent do these kind of concepts that we're talking about in the corporate world, would they transfer over to a place like the public education system, where I think public outrage should be flipped over the low pay that teachers are getting, and this idea of kind of the time value, right? If we're talking about paying teachers to get students to pass standardized tests, what about this idea of an investment that you might see 30 years in the future, and how do you incorporate that into decisions about teacher pay?
My father, who was a law professor, used to say that if you took all the money people spent on tickets to one Cleveland Browns game, you could raise the average SAT score in the Cleveland Public Schools by 10 points. And he was probably right about that. In terms of corporate governance structures, I just put that in context. One of the ways that shareholders take action is by voting in director elections. And when it comes to pay, it's compensation committee members. I think that Professor Jackson correctly pointed out you want your compensation committee members to be independent. When it's difficult to elect or to not elect, to de-elect the directors of a corporation, they're less accountable. And there are a number of different kinds of corporate governance structures that make them harder to de-elect. So one thing is this concept of staggered boards, so that all of the directors of a company are not elected at the annual shareholder meeting. You may have one or two or a subgroup. So it's hard to get rid of, throw the bastards out, as it were. The way that corporate elections are held, where there isn't a way to vote no, and that the directors are elected based on whether they get a plurality of votes and not whether they get a majority, for example. There's been a move that makes it harder to de-elect people or to prevent them from being elected. And there has been a movement towards now majority voting, so that as long as you have a quorum, the directors who don't get a majority of the votes cast should not be elected. That creates more accountability. And some of it is a little bit of inside baseball kind of stuff, but those are the kinds of corporate governance structures. Now, when will they change? They're starting to change now, and part of it, I think, is a cultural backlash. Part of it is the sense that institutional investors who represent all of us in one way or another have a fiduciary obligation to make their voices heard. And when we shout loud enough, when CalPERS or the New York pension funds or Vanguard or Fidelity, when they corner the executives of companies and the directors and they say, this will not work, we will start voting against you every time we can, they do this. So outrage has its place.
I'm less sanguine that shareholders are going to be the kind of panacea to this problem. One is that the average share of stock in 1960 was held for 5 years, in 1990 2 years, and today it's less than a year. There are long-term holders, but there's also very big proprietary trading, actively managed hedge funds, which have very short-term interests. And I think each of these solutions also don't get at part of what really goes on inside the boardroom, which is, the boardroom is a social system. It's not an antagonistic kind of environment that you would expect. Camaraderie, we're all on one team. Let's all row the boat in the same direction. And so independent directors are very rarely willing to stick their head out and challenge management's decisions because they want to be reelected, they want to get along, go along. It's no different than at a faculty meeting. Faculty sit there and they hear things that they know are atrociously wrong, but for the sake of collegiality, we keep our mouths shut. So I'm always very hesitant to suggest things to other people that I wouldn't do myself. So I think we should understand that reality. And moreover, I think one of the things that we haven't really sort of explored in some ways is how the fact that this disempowering of the directors in many ways of not seeing themselves as fiduciaries rather than just as agents of shareholders may have contributed to the problem, which is that in the last few years there's been this rhetoric of shareholder maximization, which has largely been used as a cover for giving these kinds of compensation packages. And the fact that what it does is it removes directors of actually thinking about the things that I think Professor Jackson was talking about, which is what's the long-term strategy of the company, and have we created an alignment of a culture, of the types of individuals we're hiring, of a strategy that's going to deliver on that long term. And when you think about a board that meets 4 or 5 times a year, 2 days at a time, managing a multi-billion-dollar organization of esoteric securities or businesses across the globe, that's not the kind of governance system that actually, no matter how well-meaning people are, they will actually know what's going on. So I think there's some structural issues that we have to address with the nature of the board itself, which was designed for literally managing small towns and churches and universities. That's where the historical form of corporations comes from. So.
Okay, I'm just going to exploit my moderator chair and answer what was not answered about the teachers, and simply to say that your query about why teachers are underpaid is, we can't go into the whole elaboration of that, but certainly it's a clear reflection
of cultural values, right? So that we know that one of the paradoxes is that not just teachers, but care workers who are in charge of the ill, of the elderly, of our children, are among the worst paid workers, right? So that in fact, a zookeeper earns, I've read this recently, earns more than a child care worker in many cases. So that this is maybe for the next panel. One more maybe question, and then we have to stop.
My name is Joseph Blasi. I'm at the School of Management and Labor Relations at Rutgers. And this question is asked cynically, not seriously, because I would have hoped that the reforms I'm going to talk about would have made a difference. So the question is, what is different about this new possible set of regulations which will control independence and corporate governance mechanisms from the last set that we got after Enron and WorldCom and the tech collapse? Remember, President Bush told the SEC to issue new regulations, and the NASDAQ and the New York Stock Exchange promulgated lead directors, a lead director for each board, that compensation committees had to hire the compensation consultant, not management. They put out extensive definitions of independence that are now part of the regulation, and they said that there would be no loans to the firm. So the point is, we've already gotten one set of very serious regulations from the whole process, the Business Roundtable, the SEC, the exchanges, dealing with corporate governance and independence, and now another financial collapse. And I hear, and again, this is not asked cynically, I really thought that first set would have a big effect. Why didn't it have a big effect? And what do you do next after you already spent all of those mechanisms?
Well, Joseph, you present a big challenge to answer that in 1.5 seconds or minutes. But if any of you want to try, you're welcome, and then we'll finish our session.
Sure. It's a good question. It's not one I can answer completely in 1.5 minutes, but I can try and give you an impression as to why I think this new set of regulations is different in kind with respect to compensation. I think a fair bit of the regulatory emphasis in 2003 was properly at that time on issues around accounting. So what you saw there was a total change in the way we thought about audit committees, the way we thought about expertise on the audit function. And SOX and the regulations that were promulgated reflected that emphasis. And I think a difference this time is that at the highest levels of government and industry and elsewhere, it's understood that compensation deserves a similar amount of attention. That the incentives created by compensation structures contributed to this crisis, and that it's a problem that deserves regulatory, on which we should spend regulatory and other capital. And because of that, I think you're getting change that in 2003 would have been controversial. I think you might have had serious resistance to say on pay across all American public companies, and it's passed the House. I think you might have had serious resistance to giving compensation committees full authority and funding to go out and get their own consultant. And we have that in our bill. So I think you're seeing real change, but if I'm going to be totally candid with you, I think the way our political system tends to work is that we work in increments. So we see a problem and we fix it, and we see a problem and we fix it, and we're still in that process. And I think a big part of what I'm doing in my work now is trying to get a sense for the whole scope of that problem, of the compensation issues, so that the solution that we offer this time around is more comprehensive.
Thank you. Well, actually, it's really been a privilege to hear the three of you and learn a lot, and we all thank you.